My 8-year-old grandson cried at night. I'm so scared. He's holding me. Dad won't wake up. The words latched to her bones and would not let go, looping in the small hours as if the house itself refused to forget. She woke at once, the cheap clock on the kitchen shelf, a wide-eyed witness, and ran. The hallway smelled faintly of peppermint toothpaste and engine oil, the ordinary odors of a life that had been ordinary until it wasn't. Grandson was small in the living room armchair, knees pulled up to his chest, eyes two bright drowned moons, and at the other end of the sofa lay her son. No breath, no movement, pale like paper pressed under glass. At first she thought a nightmare had walked into daylight and would be brushed off with water and a call. But when she shook him and his jaw loosened and his eyes remained hollow, the house became a courtroom. And she took the bench without meaning to. The paramedics arrived, voices clinical and efficient. The neighbors gathered like weather, but the doors of the real world had already closed behind them. What remained was a deeper, far older darkness. The coroner's initial words were careful. Overdose, accidental maybe. An unfortunate combination. Although, how often had they said those words in their city, as if syllables could patch a broken life? But her grandson's whisper, "He's holding me," echoed in her like a code that revealed its meaning only to someone who loved them both. She saw then the shape of the danger, a hand that should have defended, not trapped. A man who, in his polite smiles and charity checks, carried a shadow. He in the boy's sentence was not some random stranger. It was the same smiling man who had come for family dinners, who'd lent money, who'd kissed her son's forehead like a man who owned a right to gentleness. He was the friend who had taught her grandson how to tie a fishing knot, and who, in private, had asked for favors with a tone that made her spine curl. She started to ask questions, and the questions opened cracks in the tidy facade the city had accepted as civility. Friends admitted to seeing too long embraces, to an awkward possessiveness she'd shrugged off as intimacy. Her son's finances told a story of pressure and panic. The autopsy read like a ledger, and behind the ink was the stench of negligence and perhaps something darker. Anger came slow at first, a heat under clothing. Then it accelerated into a machine of focus as she discovered that every official report had a gap, every high-status name had an alibi, every photograph had a smiling mouth. The police told her to be patient, to trust the process. The process told her to wait until patience had been mined down to a glittering, useless powder. People like the man her grandson pointed to were fluent in institution speak and skilled at plausible narratives. They had donors and lies, and they wrapped themselves in charity while leaving corpses behind. Closed doors. If the state would not do justice. And in that town, the system preferred quiet settlements and reputations preserved. Then justice would be a craft she would learn herself. Revenge, she told herself, need not be spectacle. It needed attention, ruthlessness, and patience. She began to gather like a woman collecting winter wood, the thin kindling of proof that would start a fire no amount of money could smother. She read records with a zeal she had never applied to crossword puzzles. She logged bank transfers and private messages. She memorized times and dates like prayer. She leaned on her grandson in the daytime, teaching him to make grilled cheese and to say aloud that his father had loved him and that he was safe now. But at night she worked, an investigator with a vengeance in the shape of grief. Neighbors, at first reticent, began to talk when she offered them what they had not dared to see, the courage to put words to discomfort. An ex-employee sent screenshots she'd kept in a drawer. An old photo showed the man at a cottage where her son's car had once been noticed. An email to the company suggested hush money, thinly veiled as a consulting fee. Each small revelation was a match. The city, which had turned its head too many times toward polite men, could not pretend ignorance forever. She started to document everything in a ledger that was all the steadier, because it was personal. Names, dates, the precise timbre of the laughs that had once seemed harmless. She made alliances in places that smelled like smoke and sawdust, with the disbarred attorney who had nothing left but skill, with a reporter with a hunger for the truth and a mortgage, with the late-night lady at the coroner's office who'd noticed bruises no one wanted to catalog. Together they stitched a tapestry of the man's life that showed not the philanthropic portrait but the underside, the transactions, the silences, the threats disguised as advice. The vengeance she wanted was not merely to watch a man fall, It was to pull the rug of respectability from under every comfortable person who'd benefited from his company, to make the world uncomfortable in the way her family would never again be. She was aware always that revenge risked making her someone else, someone who would trade her grief for a ledger of harm. But that threat was bearable compared to the unvoiced memory of her grandson's small hands digging into his pajama knees and saying the one sentence that had set her life on fire. She set a plan in motion that was surgical rather than violent. Exposure followed by legal pressure, followed by financial collapse. First, the reporter she'd recruited ran a piece, not sensational, but meticulous, that laid out the breadcrumbs in public view, dates, witnesses, and the faint, hideous pattern of men who offered help in exchange for silence. The story did not end with a courtroom image. It ended with the first cracks appearing in the man's allies. Boards convened, donors reeled, and the comfortable men who had dined with him suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The man's phone began to buzz with lawyers and apologies, but apologies were currency that could not buy back a life. He claimed ignorance in interviews and used the soft defense of being misunderstood. And the town watched, polarized and petty. Her grandson, the small lamp of the household, watched too. She had to explain in sentences small and certain that this was not the child's fault, that adults could be monstrous. She told him that monsters could be named, and naming was the first step toward safety. The legal system, predictably slow, began to move. Charges were filed after another witness, a young man who had been silenced by fear and then moved by conscience, came forward with a recorded conversation. It was not enough for some people who wanted blood in the streets, but it was enough to indict. The arraignment was a performance, the kind that judges attend like tired theater, but the presence of the boy in the courtroom with a small, deliberate hand in his grandmother's palm was a loud, small miracle. The man's defense tried intimidation, then attempted character assassination, a smear campaign, old deceits, breadcrumbs of truth turned into a buffet of plausible deniability. Her family's phones were hacked, emails leaked, intimate details aired as if pain deserved spectacle. But the more they fought to tar her, the more their allies began to distance themselves. There is a particular ferocity and public shame when reputations hinge on being seen as above reproach. The woman who had once folded towels and set bowls on tables found herself the nucleus of a movement she did not desire but could not refuse. She spoke at rallies with a voice hoarse from nights of sleep she could not afford, and mothers in the crowd echoed her words. Like oars, like oars. She did not become a saint. She became a strategist whose weapon was truth. And truth, when wielded with documents and witnesses and a patient insistence on names, cuts off the oxygen of denial. The trial, when it came, was long in a way that renders every hour a small theft of sleep, of peace, of quiet. Witnesses met the stand and spoke, their voices uneven, sometimes steady, sometimes trembling, but each one was a stone placed in a dam that could no longer hold. The defense's cross-examinations were vicious, designed to turn grief into spectacle, but the prosecutor had learned to be precise and to let the paper trail do the talking. Her grandson sat through it like a small compass, guiding her towards something she had not expected to feel in the middle of the storm. A strange, slow tenderness toward him and toward the man on trial. Not because she forgave, but because she could feel the full pulse of what had been lost. The verdict, when it came, did not erase the dead hours or the days of fear. It was a sentence, a number that could not buy the life back, but it was a line in the public ledger, guilty. The man's fall was not cinematic. He went from power to a name on a list, from invitations to an empty apartment. He attempted, from behind bars, to write letters claiming he had loved the family in his own way. These letters were papered with performative regret and the old comfort of language that seeks absolution without pain. Her grandson, now a child who had learned the contour of fear, learned also the shape of justice, blunt, imperfect, necessary. Yet victory, such as it was, did not quiet the nights. She found herself awake sometimes at 2 a.m., the house silent except for the summer whir of an air conditioner, and the image of her son's hand on the doorknob would come back as if grief had its own weather pattern. In those hours, she would take her grandson into her lap and tell him about his father as if reading history aloud, about how he laughed at bad jokes, how he botched pancakes, how he'd once driven his truck into a ditch for a day. It was important to press those ordinary moments into the story, to remind both of them that a life is not only a headline. The revenge she had cooked was not solely punitive. It was restorative in small ways, the removal of a predator's smile from public stages, the granting of voice to the timid, the small rebalancing of a ledger that had long favored the polished and polite. But she also knew that revenge contains its own teeth. In exposing a man and his network, she had opened a wound in a town that liked to pretend it was decent. Some doors closed to her. Some friends distanced themselves, fearing association. Someone vandalized the garden she loved. A former ally wrote a column that called her tactics selfish. She read those words and felt the old hot need for retaliation, the almost sweet rhythm of payback. But each time she thought of her grandson's thin chest, the curve of his small mouth in sleep, and she tempered herself. Revenge had to end somewhere, and if it ended in the embers of their lives being safe, that would be enough. Over months and then years, she rebuilt a life that obeyed a new geometry. She planted bulbs for the spring. She learned how to make her grandson laugh so loudly that the sound pushed air out of the house like wind through shutters. She volunteered at the school because there are ways to take sorrow and braid it into something that helps other people's children. She took on the small bureaucratic fights to change policy, pushing for better reporting requirements and survivor support. Those fights were painfully incremental, the kind of work that a headline cannot love, but they mattered. The man's conviction rippled further than the courthouse. One by one, other men who had been protected by the same network found themselves without sanctuaries. Boards were reconstituted, donors asked hard questions, and the city learned a new vocabulary: accountability. Accountability. She did not claim credit publicly for all these changes. She was not greedy for applause, but she kept a ledger of who had said what when, because history is a terrible thing to leave to the comfortable. Her grandson grew awkward and stubborn and brilliant at video games, and he kept a notebook where he wrote little lists of the things he could do now that he no longer feared the dark. In time, as children do, he learned to trust adults again, and in time he walked into classrooms without carrying the shadow like a second lunchbox. She watched him at school plays and soccer matches, sometimes thinking she could feel her son's echo in the way the boy carried himself, then pulling that thought back like a hand from heat. The woman who had become an avenger found that the revenge's true final gift was permission to grieve in a way that was not secret. Small rituals, a bowl of his favorite cherries in summer, the care of the truck he loved, the mound of mail she did not open, became her shrine and her therapy. Friends returned in slow degrees. Some came bearing casseroles, some bearing silence, and some bearing the question she knew they carried. Was it worth it? She could not answer for everyone. For her, the work had not been about satisfaction but about legacy. Her son's name would not be smoothed out of the record by glossy donations and polite smiles. The boy who had cried in the night would grow up in a world where his voice mattered. And yet, revenge also taught her humility. There were times when the machinery of exposure hurt innocents who had been foolish but not vicious. There were lawyers who learned to bend truth, and activists who discovered that righteous anger can burn its own camp. She learned to temper the righteous flame with care, to separate the men who had truly harmed from the men who had erred, because cruelty is a tedious thing to seed widely. In the end, the narrative that comforts the public, that the villain was punished and the family restored, was too small. Real life is a messy ledger of victory and compromise, of nights of laughter and nights when grief re-enters like tide. She came to see her revenge as one chapter among many, the glaring red chapter that set the rest into motion. The book that followed contained other pages, small ones, bright ones, where her grandson learned to whistle, where they took a trip to the coast and collected shells, where she faced a sunrise and felt not absence, but a hollow in which something like gratitude could grow. When she let candor into her sentences, she admitted to herself that there is a cost to being the engine of another's downfall. She lost quiet and anonymity. She acquired a reputation at once heroic and contentious. She had to endure the whispers of people who believed that a woman should forgive and forget rather than shove a man into the harsh light. But she also had pressed into her hands like something tangible and bright. The knowledge that a small boy had been saved from being held down in the dark, that a father's name would not be quietly purchased away, and that other families might be spared the secret smear of a polite predator's deeds. No rather, years later, on the anniversary of the night her grandson had cried, they lit a candle and read aloud a list of things they would not forget. Not only the pain and the wrong, but also the way the boy's laugh had once cracked through despair and resembled hope. That night she let herself imagine a life not defined by a single moment, but by a dozen tiny moments that made it bearable. The smell of coffee at dawn, the comfort of a patched sleeve, the sound of a child's feet running in bare feet across tiles. She forgave not the man who had taken their ordinary safety, but the idea that sorrow must always be turned inward. She had turned her sorrow into a map that others could follow. Not a map to revenge, but a map to vigilance. And if you asked her whether it had been worth it, she would, without hesitation, say yes, because the boy now sleeping in the next room had a pulse full of promises. Revenge had not brought her son back. Only time and memory could do that. What it had brought was a measure of justice and, more importantly, a reckoning for a town too used to looking the other way. The story did not end in courtroom drama or in cinematic retribution. It continued in the quiet of the household as they moved forward, carrying scars like medals and teaching the boy that courage looks like calling out what is wrong and staying when things are hard. She kept the ledger, but she also kept a photograph of her son laughing, and when the ledger felt like weight, she set it down and let the image of that laugh be the thing that carried her across the day.